I'm Emily, 32, the youngest daughter and the one they never planned for. I used to think maybe they'd see me one day, but even when the house was at stake, they said it's all for Mara. They had the papers ready, the champagne chilled, and not a glance in my direction. But when the pen touched the page, something made them stop. The sun had already dipped below the line of oak trees behind my parents' house when I pulled into the driveway. The windows glowed a soft orange, casting long shadows across the lawn. Laughter spilled faintly through the open kitchen window. I paused before getting out of the car, my hand still on the steering wheel. It had been years since I'd walked into that house without hesitation. But tonight wasn't about confrontation. It was just dinner. Mara had said it would be just family. Inside the dining room smelled like roasted rosemary chicken and warm bread. The long table was dressed in soft beige linen, the good china out. Mara sat at the center, a glass of wine in hand, her diamond engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly. Diane was bustling in and out with extra napkins humming. Dad was already seated, pouring wine with a familiarity I'd grown distant from. I walked in quietly, not wanting to interrupt the rhythm they had clearly rehearsed without me. Mara glanced up briefly. "Oh, Emily, you made it." Her smile was polite, not warm. Diane didn't look up. "There's a folding chair in the garage," she said, still arranging the placemats. I didn't ask why a seat wasn't ready. I simply turned, went to the garage, and retrieved the metal chair myself. When I came back, no one had paused. I pulled the chair up to the very end of the table, not quite close enough to be part of the circle. Mara was talking about her new condo, and the best part, Mom and Dad said once the paperwork's done, they'll just transfer the title over. It's symbolic, of course, it's their way of saying it's mine. My fork scraped the plate a little too loudly. No one reacted. I mean, she continued, it's just a formality, really. We've always known who would carry the house after them. No one looked at me. I kept my gaze on the roasted carrots, pushing them slowly around the plate. The night moved on smooth as porcelain. They laughed about stories I wasn't part of. They exchanged glances that excluded me without malice, just habit. That's what stung the most. I wasn't being punished. I was simply forgotten. At one point, Mara pulled out her phone and held it toward Diane. "Remember this, the family barbecue from 3 summers ago, I wasn't in a single photo." I excused myself to the bathroom halfway through dessert. I didn't need to go. I just needed to breathe. In the dim hallway, I glanced at the photo wall. Every frame was full weddings, birthdays, graduations. My place in them seemed to shrink with each passing year. Or maybe I had never really been in them to begin with. As I walked back toward the dining room, I heard Dad's voice. "We'll finalize everything next month. Once Mara's name is on the deed, it'll be official. No complications." And Mara's voice, light and confident. "It'll be nice not having any loose ends." I stopped in the hallway. My fingers traced the wood paneling. Loose ends. That's what I was now. A detail to be tied off. Back at the table, I sat down without a word. The dessert plates had been cleared. "We were thinking," Diane said, suddenly glancing at me now, "that maybe you could take a short vacation during the move. Just until everything settles. Mara's got a lot on her plate, and it's easier if, well, less people are around." I nodded. I didn't argue. I folded the napkin slowly and placed it next to my glass. "You understand, right?" Diane asked. I smiled gently. Of course, and I meant it. I understood perfectly. That night I stayed in my old room, still intact but untouched. The wallpaper I'd picked at 14 was faded. The bookshelf still held dusty trophies from a life they'd long stopped acknowledging. I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling, the laughter from downstairs still faintly humming through the vents. Even after dinner, they hadn't invited me to join them in the living room, and I hadn't asked. The next morning, the house was already humming with movement. Diane was in the kitchen humming a hymn under her breath while slicing strawberries for Mara's favorite breakfast, French toast with whipped cream. Mara walked in wearing one of Diane's old robes like it was her own. I poured myself coffee in silence. The chipped mug I always used as a teenager had been pushed to the back of the cupboard. I took it out, rinsed it, and sipped quietly by the window. "Emily, could you take the recycling out?" Diane asked without turning. "We're doing a deep clean before Mara's official move-in." I nodded. There was no mention of where I'd be when Mara moved in. In the garage, I passed the large labeled boxes: Mara's kitchen, Mara's office, Mara's master bedroom. No box had my name. I wasn't moving out. I wasn't moving in. I was just moving around the edges. Later that afternoon, a manila envelope arrived at the house. Diane opened it at the kitchen table. "Oh, good," she murmured. "Mr. Franklin already sent over the documents for the property transfer. We'll sign them this weekend." My chest tightened for a moment, but I didn't ask. It was better that way. That evening, they planned a small get-together. Just close friends and family, Mara said. When I asked if I could help, Diane waved me off. "We've got it covered, honey." I stayed upstairs as guests arrived. From my window, I watched as car after car pulled into the driveway. People I hadn't seen in years hugged Mara like she was royalty. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed. At one point, I saw Dad raise a toast, his voice booming, "To the future of this house, Mara's house." I turned away from the window. Around 9, I finally came downstairs. The party had mellowed guests lounging around with wine glasses, soft jazz playing in the background. I wasn't wearing anything special, just a navy sweater and jeans, but the moment I stepped into the room, I felt overdressed and underprepared. "Oh, Emily," Diane said, surprised. "You're still here?" "I live here," I said gently. Her eyes flickered. Of course. Mara caught sight of me and gave a small wave. "Emily, can you help bring out the dessert plates?" I nodded. In the kitchen, I balanced the china on a tray, careful not to let the spoons slide. As I stepped into the living room, I tripped slightly. The rug had shifted, and one plate wobbled before I caught it. A few guests glanced up. No one asked if I was okay. After dessert, Mr. Franklin arrived. He was late, but no one minded. A kind man in his 60s, always neatly dressed, briefcase in hand. "I thought I'd drop by with the official deed transfer," he said, smiling. "Just need a few quick signatures." Diane beamed. Of course, Mara, come sit." Mr. Franklin laid the documents on the dining table, clicked his pen, and flipped to the first page. As Mara leaned over to sign, he hesitated. "Actually, before we proceed, there's a clarification I'd like to make." Everyone paused. The room moments ago full of idle conversation grew still. "This property," he said, adjusting his glasses, "was transferred into a name last year. By your husband, Mr. Whitmore. He completed the process with me and requested it remain discreet until a formal occasion." Mara looked confused. "My husband—" What? Diane leaned in. "Wait, what do you mean, a name? Whose name?" Mr. Franklin smiled faintly and turned the paper around. I already knew what it would say. I didn't move. "Emily Whitmore," he read. The room fell silent. No one said a word. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner louder than it had ever sounded before. Glasses were halfway to lips. Someone's fork hovered in midair, unmoving. Mr. Franklin stayed perfectly still, eyes gently scanning the faces across the table like a teacher waiting for a class to settle. Diane finally spoke, her voice cracking slightly. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Mr. Franklin said, still calm. "Mr. Whitmore came to my office last October. He said Emily had held this house together during the worst of times, that it was time she had something she could rely on. My hands were folded in front of me, resting in my lap. I hadn't moved since the announcement. My heart was pounding, but you wouldn't have seen it." Mara's face twisted, half disbelief, half something sharper. "You never said a word." "I wasn't asked," I replied softly. Diane looked at me like she was seeing someone else entirely. "You didn't think to mention this?" "To your family?" I met her gaze for a moment, then looked away. "You seemed so sure it wasn't mine." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic or loud. It was the kind of silence that sat heavy in the air, made people clear their throats just to break it. No one congratulated me. No one protested. They just recalibrated. Mr. Franklin closed the folder. "The paperwork is complete. There's nothing left to sign." He nodded at me before leaving his business card on the counter and letting himself out, polite as always. A few guests awkwardly excused themselves. Shoes shuffled, doors creaked. Outside, I heard a car engine start. I stood up quietly and began to collect the dessert plates. No one stopped me. In the kitchen, I ran warm water over the dishes, the steam rising around my face. From the hallway, I could hear Mara telling Diane she needed air. Their voices were hushed now. When I walked out of the kitchen, Dad was standing alone near the fireplace, staring into the unlit logs. "You knew?" he asked. "I didn't," I said. He didn't press further. I moved past him and headed for the stairs. At the base of the staircase, I paused. My hand brushed the banister, the same one I used to slide down as a kid. I looked back at the room one last time. They weren't looking at me, but they weren't talking either. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. Upstairs, I closed the door behind me with a soft click. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That night, no one knocked on my door. And downstairs, the laughter never quite picked up again. It started with the invitations. Mara's engagement had been announced with flare-crisp embossed cards on cream-colored stock gold foil lettering mailed to family friends and more than a few distant acquaintances we hadn't spoken to in years. One arrived for me eventually, but it wasn't addressed directly. It was sent to the house to Emily Whitmore Guest. Guest. Not sister of the bride. Not family. Just guest. I didn't bring it up. I slipped the card into the drawer where I kept appliance manuals and expired coupons, a quiet place for quiet things. The weeks that followed were full of planning and exclusion. Diane hosted cake tastings, dress fittings, floral consultations. The house buzzed with activity, but never for me. They called Mara's friends her chosen sisters. They gave her cousin Julia the role of maid of honor. They asked me once if I could help carry chairs from the garage to the backyard. I nodded. That was the extent of my involvement. One afternoon, I came home from work and found the kitchen table littered with wedding samples, fabric swatches, invitation proofs, a 3-tier cake sketch with sugar orchids. Diane was on the phone laughing while Mara circled the table with a pen checking boxes. "Oh, Em," Diane said without looking up, "can you grab more bottled water from the garage? We've got a lot to go over." I stepped back outside without saying a word. Later that week, I overheard Mara in the hallway speaking into her phone. She's not really the wedding type. Not photogenic. Not great with people. She didn't know I was behind the door. I sat on the stairs for a long time after that. The rehearsal dinner was held at a local vineyard, wide open spaces, long white tables, fairy lights strung between trees. It looked like something from a magazine. There were name cards at each place setting. Mine wasn't on the family table. I found it eventually tucked on the far end near the catering tent next to a stack of extra napkins. No one said anything. When Mara arrived radiant in white with a flower crown tucked into her hair, the room lit up. Diane stood beside her like a proud curator unveiling a masterpiece. "Isn't she stunning?" someone whispered nearby. Mara's always been the golden one. I sipped my water. During the toasts, Diane stood up with a champagne flute and said to my daughter, "The light of our family." She didn't glance in my direction, and I didn't expect her to. The photographer came by calling for the bride and her sisters. I stood thinking perhaps, but he waved me aside. "Just the girls in the wedding party," he said not unkindly. "Sorry." I stepped back. From where I stood, I could see Mara laughing, one hand on Diane's shoulder. The other girls leaned in, clinking glasses. The photographer snapped photo after photo. My champagne remained untouched. When it got dark, fairy lights flickered on. I found a spot beneath a tree away from the crowd. The laughter carried on the breeze. My chair wobbled slightly on the uneven grass, but I didn't bother to move. Eventually, Dad came over. He handed me a plate of hors d'oeuvres without speaking. We sat in silence. "She wanted this to be perfect," he said finally. "Your mother. Mara, too." "I know. You understand, right? I do," I said, and I meant it. But understanding doesn't erase the sting. It just teaches you where to place it so no one sees. 2 days before the wedding, I stopped by the house to drop off a gift. Not for Mara. For Dad, a leather-bound copy of Leaves of Grass. He used to read it to me when I was younger, back before things got quiet between us. Diane answered the door. "Oh, "It's you," she said, as if I'd arrived uninvited. "I just wanted to leave this for Dad." She didn't invite me in, just held the door open wide enough for me to slip through and place the book on the console table in the hallway. Mara's wedding gown hung in the dining room, pressed perfect, untouched. "You're not staying for dinner," Diane said. It wasn't a question. "No." She nodded like she'd expected that. Behind her, I heard Mara's voice. "Mom, did the wine get delivered? We need the rosé chilled before Saturday. I'll check." Neither of them looked at me. I left. That night I had dinner alone, a frozen dinner. The microwave hummed, and the kitchen clock ticked loud against the silence. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I just sat there, fork in hand, and let it be. The morning of the wedding came wrapped in sunlight. I wasn't part of the bridal prep, so I dressed in my room's simple navy dress, pearl earrings, hair pulled back. Neutral, unobtrusive, guest-like. At the venue, guests gathered in clusters of pastels and pressed suits. I walked slowly toward the rows of white chairs arranged on the lawn. An usher stopped me halfway. "Are you family?" he asked, eyes glancing down at his list. I paused. "Yes." "Emily Whitmore?" He checked. "Ah, yes. You're in section C. Third row from the back. C? Third row from the back?" I nodded and followed the gravel path. The ceremony began with violin music. Mara walked down the aisle on Dad's arm, radiant, while camera shutters clicked. Diane cried softly in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. I sat in section C behind a row of sorority friends who whispered through the vows. When the officiant asked if anyone had reason to object, a breeze moved through the trees, but no one spoke. At the reception, I took a seat near the photo booth, one of the few spots still open. The table assignments had been posted on a decorative mirror, but mine wasn't there. I waited. No one noticed. Eventually, a server came by with a tray of drinks. Champagne. I shook my head. He hesitated. "This is for family only." My smile didn't reach my eyes. "Right." He moved on. Later, Mara and her husband danced their first dance. The room dimmed, the music soft and sweeping. Diane joined midway, her arms around both of them. Dad clapped along, beaming. I looked around and realized I was invisible, not metaphorically, truly. No one looked my way. Even when I stood up and walked to the restroom, no one shifted. No one paused. It was as if I didn't exist. And yet I felt everything. In the hallway near the coat room, I saw a picture pinned to a corkboard, Mara and me as kids. One of the rare ones where we looked like sisters, laughing in matching pajamas. Someone had written beneath it, "The Whitmore Girls." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't take it down. I didn't touch it. Just stood there and remembered what it felt like to belong. Later in the evening, while the speeches were underway, I returned to my seat. The mic passed from one cousin to another, all singing Mara's praises. Then Diane stood up. "I just want to say," she began, voice trembling with emotion, "how proud I am of you, Mara. You've always been the one with grace, with vision. You've made us all so proud." She paused. "You are what this family needed." I didn't flinch. Someone at my table whispered, "Didn't she have a sister?" Another shrugged, and I sat there, hands folded in my lap, wondering how silence could feel so loud. The night stretched on. Speeches gave way to clinking glasses and the hum of conversation. I stepped outside to breathe the cool air washing over my skin like clarity. Near the garden fountain, a cluster of guests laughed around a fire pit. I stayed in the shadows, watching the flicker of flames on their faces. My name was never spoken. It had been years since I stopped expecting warmth from Diane. But tonight, something settled. A truth I hadn't wanted to accept until it stood in front of me in full makeup and a tailored suit. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional. I was deliberately erased. Inside, the cake was being wheeled out. A towering three-tiered thing with gold trim and sugar flowers. A little girl ran past me, chasing bubbles from a toy wand. She didn't even glance my way. I walked back in, weaving between tables like a shadow. A server collecting empty flutes paused and offered me one last glass. I took it, not to drink but to hold something in my hand. It felt like armor. At the table near the front, Diane leaned in and whispered something into Mara's ear. Mara turned slightly, just enough to glance in my direction. Our eyes met for a split second. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at me like I was someone she once knew and chose to forget. I nodded, just once. A gesture so small it was nearly invisible, but it held decades of words I would never say out loud. Then I stood and walked toward the exit. No fanfare, no slamming doors or turned heads, just the steady click of my heels on hardwood floors fading into the night. On my way out, I passed the gift table. Wrapped boxes, silver bows, a dozen envelopes tucked into a ceramic vase. I reached into my bag, pulled out a slim manila envelope and quietly placed it at the bottom of the stack. No one saw me. The envelope contained one thing, a notarized copy of the deed to the Whitmore house. In my name. It wasn't a revenge play. It wasn't meant to shock or punish. It was just time. Time to stop asking for space at a table that never set a seat for me. Outside, I slid into my car. As I turned the key, the headlights lit up the stone facade of the reception hall. People were laughing inside. Music pulsed through the walls. They hadn't noticed I was gone. I backed out slowly, the tires crunching over gravel, and whispered to myself, not in anger but in peace. I didn't need them to see me, just to know I was never gone. And with that, I drove off into the night, leaving behind everything except my name, etched finally where it could never be erased. A week after the wedding, a cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment. It was thick, heavy, and bore the embossed seal of Franklin & Co.'s Law. I already knew what it was, but I took my time opening it. Inside was a formal invitation to the final reading of my grandfather's estate attendance required for all direct heirs. The date was marked 3 days out at the old Whitmore property. Not the firm's office downtown. The house. The irony didn't escape me. I arrived early. The driveway still crunched the same way under tires, and the wraparound porch still creaked at the same spots. But the people who once filled it with noise and holidays, they were long gone. Except for a few of us. I parked to the side and walked toward the front door, past the flower beds Mara used to trample, chasing fireflies, and the oak swing Dad built before he started forgetting birthdays. Inside, the room was already half full. Diane sat near the head of the table in a navy blue suit, lips pursed so tightly they barely touched the coffee cup in her hand. Mara was on her phone laughing at something I would never be part of. Neither looked up when I entered. Mr. Franklin stood by the fireplace, flipping through a folder. He noticed me and gave the slightest nod, the kind you return with your chin, not your smile. "Good morning, Emily," he said quietly, like a secret between two people who've waited too long to be heard. The room filled quickly. Cousins, uncles, the kind who sent Christmas cards but never called. Everyone took their seats, low murmurs filling the space until the clock struck 10. Mr. Franklin cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. Today we are here to conclude the wishes of Henry Whitmore, who passed on March 3rd. Diane dabbed at her eye with a tissue that hadn't touched a single tear. He continued, his voice steady, matter-of-fact. As stated in Mr. Whitmore's final will and testament, portions of the estate will be distributed as follows: names, numbers, stocks. A nephew got a sailboat he never sailed. An aunt got jewelry she'd already worn. Then Mara's name, she lit up like a candle. A trust of $250,000 to Mara Whitmore, along with the heirloom collection and all personal effects within the West Wing." She smirked. Diane squeezed her hand. And then the room stilled. Mr. Franklin closed one folder, opened another. "And as for the Whitmore family home lot, 547 in Hampton Woods." A pause. He looked at me. "This property was transferred prior to Mr. Whitmore's passing via deed of gift, notarized and sealed. The home now belongs solely to Emily Whitmore." A chair scraped. Someone gasped. Mara dropped her phone. Diane stared at Mr. Franklin like he'd mispronounced gravity. "That's not possible," she said, her voice tight. "It's legal," he replied, not unkindly. "Executed 2 years ago. Filed, witnessed, and mailed to her name with his full intention." No one spoke. The ticking clock on the mantelpiece suddenly sounded too loud, like it was counting down to a truth that had always been waiting. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there quiet, composed, while the room rearranged its understanding of me. Diane stood up so abruptly her chair rocked back. "No one told us about this," she said sharply. "There's no way Henry would have promised that house to the family." Mr. Franklin didn't flinch. Henry was clear in his intentions. He made that decision after several private discussions, and all documents were prepared in accordance with state law. Mara's face had gone pale. Her fingers clenched the hem of her dress. "You're lying," she snapped. He loved me. He said I'd carry on the family name. He also said, Franklin added gently, that people who love you don't need to be reminded with possessions. He told me Emily had nothing to prove. She'd already shown him everything through action. All eyes turned to me. Some curious, some confused, and a few like Diane's full of disbelief, not at the fact but at the fact they'd overlooked it. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. I folded my hands in my lap, glanced toward the window where the sunlight was starting to break through heavy clouds. Mr. Franklin continued, "There is no contest clause in this document. Any dispute will render the claimants ineligible for their assigned assets." A subtle warning, one that landed like a stone in water. No one wanted to be cut off entirely. Diane sat back down, but slower this time, like her bones had aged 5 years in 2 minutes. Mara wouldn't look at me, but I could feel her thinking, replaying past years, the birthday dinners I wasn't invited to, the whispered jokes, the subtle rewrites of family memory, and I let her sit with that. Not out of revenge, not for power, but because the silence between us now said more than anything ever had. When the reading ended, people started filtering out, most avoiding eye contact. Some gave me polite nods, those distant cousins who never quite knew where to place me in the family line. Mr. Franklin closed his folder and walked toward me. He told me, he said softly, that you didn't ask for the house. That's why he gave it to you. I nodded once. He knew you'd never use it to prove a point. I won't, I said. But you did prove something today, he added. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked toward the hallway, the one lined with portraits of people who had all expected something that day. At the end hung a small, almost forgotten photo of my grandfather and me in the garden. I must have been 9. He was kneeling by the roses, dirt on his gloves. I had a book in my hands, reading aloud while he trimmed the thorns. They always told me I didn't belong in that house, but he made sure I'd always have a key. When I stepped outside, the afternoon air felt cooler than before, like the house itself had exhaled a truth long held in. My heels clicked softly against the stone path as I walked toward my car. No one followed me. At the bottom of the steps, I paused. The house loomed behind me, not in a menacing way, but heavy with memory, good and bad. I glanced back once. The door was still open, voices inside muffled and scattered. Someone had started crying. I didn't need to know who. I reached into my purse and pulled out the old brass key, the original one Grandpa gave me when I turned 18. It still had the red ribbon tied to it, faded now. I'd kept it all these years, tucked away, never assuming it meant anything more than sentiment. Now I knew better. Sliding the key into the palm of my hand, I squeezed it gently, then I got into the car. As I adjusted the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of Mara standing by the front window. Her arms were crossed, her lips tight, but her eyes weren't angry. Just lost. I didn't wave. Some moments deserve to end in quiet. Driving away, the neighborhood looked the same as it always had: manicured lawns, mailboxes with little flags, wine chimes dancing lazily in the breeze. But something in me had shifted. For years I thought silence was a sign of defeat, that being overlooked meant being lesser, that holding back, letting things go, would leave me forgotten. But sitting in that room, hearing Grandpa's words through someone else's voice, I realized silence can also be a form of strength, a reservoir, and when the time is right, it speaks loud enough for everyone. I stopped at the end of the block. One last time I looked back. The house was still there, still big, still beautiful, still full of people rearranging their memories to make sense of what just happened, and me, I was still quiet. But they heard me now. I turned the corner and didn't look back again. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with a door closing softly, a steady breath, a quiet seat reclaimed. Not because anyone asked for it, but because it was hers all along.